Some years back, the Historic Preservation Commission in my home county undertook a melancholy project. Traveling the county's back roads, the commissioners placed metal signs at the site of what are called abandoned towns. These are towns that have been planned and even established, but that no longer exist. There were a surprising many of these places, more than 20 in all. And the signs for them have an effect on me that is similar to what I feel when I see the ruins of a forgotten farmstead. Just as sway-backed barns and broken windowed houses make me contemplate generations gone and hopes surrendered, so too do these grave markers of places that are, quoth, nevermore. One sign stands next to a field where my family did, for several years, hunt rabbits, pheasants, and quail. The town was to be called Belfast, and I wonder about the man, a Mr. James Gibson, who laid it out in July 1837. What had been his vision, his aspiration? Surely in his mind's eye, he saw streets and houses, perhaps a post office and general store. Or had he allowed his imagination to run? Was Belfast going to be as big as its namesake in Europe? Was it to be the next Pittsburgh or Cincinnati? Looking over that field today, there is nothing to suggest that a town should or even could be there. Mr. Gibson's streets were never built. The people never came. Towns fade. Towns die. For as long as towns have been appearing, they have been disappearing. Some towns, like Belfast, are stillborn. And almost by definition, the smaller the town, the greater the risk. Not so much of disappearance, but of crashing, crushing irrelevance. Some people seem to accept this as the inevitable outcome of urbanization. But I say no. We should, all of us, shout out our love of small towns as loudly and incessantly as a tornado siren at noontime. Because small towns have great power and great potential. They are bulwarks of our spirits. They are wellsprings of strength. In tethering us to our rural agrarian past, they anchor us against the disorienting storms of the present. I would go so far as to say that the best small towns are an antidote against an epidemic, terrible but hidden, that is attacking our nation. The epidemic of loneliness. Small towns are a big idea. They are an idea worth sharing. Regrettably, this is not the prevailing message. Experts have been writing the eulogy for our rural places for decades. Consider just one headline: Rural America is dying. What can we do about it? Then there are the books. I was just coming into my current career field, rural economic development, when in rapid succession, we got caught in the middle and hollowing out the middle about the decline of the rural Midwest. My state, Iowa, often features in these stories. Join with me, if you would, on an adventure in a time machine. The airlocks close. The motors whine. And we rotate the dial back 119 years to 1900. McKinley is the president. The American League just completed its inaugural season. When the doors open, we will step out into an Iowa that is the nation's 10th most populous state, with more people than Alabama, Minnesota, New Jersey, and even California. But the future will not be so kind. Over the course of the 20th century, Iowa will endure the nation's slowest rate of population growth. The problem persists right into this century. 71 of Iowa's 99 counties have fewer people in them than they did a decade ago. That story is written in padlocked schools, shuttered stores, and silent churches. This trend, contraction, puts rural Iowa and rural America in direct opposition to one of our nation's most strongly held beliefs, namely, new beats old. We demand new jobs, new restaurants. Some of us would even like to have new neighbors. This brings up a question to me. Is it possible? Is it even relevant to evaluate the health of small towns that aren't in fact growing? Surely it's not binary. It can't just be synonym and antonym. If bigger is better, then smaller sucks. Some researchers at Iowa State University took a run at this problem. They compared quality of life data for 98 small towns across Iowa over a 20-year period. Towns where the population was getting smaller and yet people actually felt like life was getting better were said to be shrinking smart. My purpose is not to reprise the researchers' findings, but in general, residents of smart shrinking towns are more engaged in community groups and projects. They feel their town is trusting, safe, and open to new ideas. They think most folks are pulling in the same direction. It sounds nice, right? It's like Washington, D.C. Yeah, I know, sarcasm. But I can't help thinking that the best attributes of rural America, trust, openness, collaboration, are the antithesis of political America and social media America. They suggest the possibility of a country and a culture that are less acquisitive, less angry, more optimistic. Perhaps the one thing we can all agree on is we are living in a fractured, isolating time. Suicide rates are climbing. Drug overdoses kill 70,000 people a year. In a survey of 20,000 adults, nearly half reported feeling alone or left out. 43% said their relationships were not meaningful. And what is loneliness? Is it simply the absence of people? In which case we should, all of us, ascend to the cities. No. Robin Williams once said, "I used to think the worst thing in life was to end up alone. It's not. The worst thing is to end up with people who make you feel alone." Vibrant small towns help heal this aloneness because they are efficient at meeting a pair of needs that are innate to all of us. The first is the need to matter, to be significant. In a town of 1,000, the distance between action and outcome contracts. I've seen a dozen folks in a tiny hamlet pitch in to save the local hardware store. I've seen a business close its doors for the afternoon so the team could go off and paint a picnic shelter. I've even seen a cluster of small towns rally around the young professionals to put on a TEDx event. As a city manager friend of mine says, small towns are better at expecting people, not corporations, not government, but people to get the job done. The most meaningful stories, of course, are of lives renewed in a small town. I was once talking to the owner of a manufacturing company in southern Minnesota. By any measure, this guy has made it. Big, imposing factory, well-known brand. And yet he told me what means the most to him is that he once hired 3 guys who were, in his words, still wearing ankle bracelets. Today, they are his supervisors. Consider the influence of those 3 in a town of 3,200. Then consider the influence of that founder. He and we find meaning in mattering. And then through our engagement, we come to satisfy the second need, which is for community. Small towns are an endless series of social collisions. You might be in spin class with your boss's wife, or bump into your preacher and your bartender at the grocery store. Hopefully not in the liquor aisle. This is significant because relationships are actually built on repetition. So the place to become connected is not necessarily the one with the most people, but what we might call proximity. Can this feel constricting? Yes, it can. But it can also be expanding. A friend of mine pointed out that in a city, he could probably find other people with the exact same interests as his own. By comparison, in his small town, broadening his circle has meant broadening his interests. It seems perhaps the wider world is beginning to intuit the healing power of small town life. Throw out those bummer statistics I gave you earlier and focus on this. Yes, only 32% of people in America now live in rural places and small towns, but 39% say they want to. In 2016 and 2017, rural America gained population for the first time since the financial crisis. Many of the new arrivals were millennials. We can probably guess at why urban and suburban dwellers might decamp. They are harried, stressed, overstimulated, and they crave the soothing kiss of a cool breeze, bird songs in the morning, tree frogs at night. That, I must say, is an idealized version of country life. There are never any manure spreaders in a person's imagination. But this story is not idealized. It's genuine. It's my story. I have a friend who offers a beautiful illustration for towns that are thriving despite getting smaller. He compares them to a pear tree in his backyard that was struck by lightning. Half of it fell, but the tree recovered to become a full and healthy half of itself. That image glows in my heart, not just for the promise it holds for our small towns, but because too often I feel like I'm moving through life as only half of myself. Doubt, insecurity, and shame pulse behind my forehead, deadening moments of joy and turning the worst times into staggers between my own self-inflicted lightning bolts. This probably comes as a surprise to you, those of you who only know my public self, because I'm loud, talkative, laughing. But in quiet times in my car or on my patio, disappointment threatens to cleave me in two. I believe the small towns I've called home have helped keep me whole. My wife and I moved to Northwest Iowa 5 years ago. Not long after we arrived, I recall attending a basketball game. Looking around the gymnasium that night, I was not able to find a single person I knew, not a single person to sit down beside. In that moment, all I wanted was to go back home. But day by day, encounters became re-encounters. To faces were added names and then stories, culminating in a football game this fall. It was a chilly night, and my wife wanted a cup of hot chocolate, but I don't think she ever got it. On the way to the concession stand, I got distracted. I was talking to a half a dozen different people. Two of them were I'd coached Little League with. One of them was my banker. One of them went to my church. They are connections beyond acquaintances. They are my friends, and there are a lot of them. In my small town, I am sometimes sad, but I am never lonely. So let's climb back into our time machine. For this journey, we'll rotate the dial forward to 2050. What will we find when the doors open? That depends on us. If we buy into the narrative that rural decline is inevitable and irreversible, then we'll continue to tell our kids to go anywhere but here. Or worse, we'll close ourselves off with shut down minds and bumper stickers that tell others, screw off, that America and our little slice of it are full. And if we do that, then your small town, my small town, will have no more relevance than forgotten Belfast, a town that never was. But I believe we are wiser. I believe we will pull in the same direction to create places and spaces where people of all backgrounds can engage, connect, and come to belong. Places that truly are safe, trusting, and open to new ideas. And if we do that, well, then why even talk about shrinking? The wondrous, the obvious blessing is that with small towns, sharing is synonymous with growing. Thank you very much.